At a stake conference last week in Idaho, in the Sandpoint stake, members of the church were rebuked by leadership for being insufficiently compliant with the prophet during the recent COVID ordeal that we all went through. This is in reference to the letter where we were urged into compliance with wearing the thing on our face and getting the injectable thing in our arm. It's ridiculous that we have to use euphemisms to not get shadow banned and shut down on YouTube and Facebook and whatever, but you all know what I'm referring to. We're going to start with a clip. This was broadcast on the YouTube channel for the stake, supposedly because some people are still doing church at home and don't want to go to buildings and meetings. So we have a video recording of it. I'm going to share a clip first from the stake president with a portion of what he talked about, and then we'll get into it a little bit.
Brothers and sisters, I'll get real with you here for a second. A few years back when COVID hit, I think a lot of people struggled with counsel from the prophet. It was difficult, and I know that because I talked to different people about it. And some people may not have seen some of the benefits. And I think it actually may have shaken some people's testimonies of the prophet, which saddened me. But I also saw others who did listen to the counsel that the prophet gave, and they grew. Even though they didn't understand it, we don't always understand some of the counsel that we're receiving. But interestingly enough, there's a promise that we have, that we've been given, that if we listen to the counsel of a prophet, of a leader, we will be blessed no matter what. We will be safe. Sometimes that safety is our testimony, and our testimony of the Savior and his gospel.
All right, so let's unpack that a little bit, and then we're next going to go to the 70 who kind of doubled down on this issue at this stake conference. So first off, the stake president here is talking about counsel from a prophet. The core issue, and I've talked about this in past musings, is that not everything that the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints says is inherently and automatically prophetic. And yet we have this weird doctrine in recent decades that the prophet, when the prophet gives counsel, that is what should be followed. So in this case, the stake president referring to counsel from the prophet. We received counsel from the prophet, so we should do it. Just this position that all statements made by that leader of the church constitute prophetic counsel. He noted that that the ordeal shook some people's testimony of the prophet. I thought that was a curious choice of words. Testimony of the prophet. We don't bear our testimony in fast and testimony meeting of the prophet. We bear our testimony of Christ. This is the Church of Jesus Christ. Our testimony should be rooted and centered and focused in Christ. We sustain prophets. They have a role to play, but I don't know that we have a testimony of them. And prophets, like everybody in their calling, have the potential to be prophets. It doesn't mean that they are prophets, right? When I am ordained into a particular office of the priesthood, when I am sustained in a calling, it doesn't mean that I am suddenly this authoritative figure that can do no wrong because everything I do is magnified and divinely ordained and consistent with God's will. It's that the potential exists for me to rise to that level of congruity with God. So we sustain prophets. I don't think we have a testimony of them. So for the stake president to say that it shook some people's testimony of the prophet, I thought that was a little weird. If anything, that a lot of the people that I know who struggled with that first presidency letter, I'll read a portion of it in a bit, have really deeply focused on their testimony of Christ and seeking personal revelation to know what they should do during that whole ordeal with the things that we were all mandated to do. And many of these, not all, but many of these people have gained a stronger testimony of God as a result of this. They didn't focus on having a testimony of prophets. If anything, they gained more nuance as to when an individual who is sustained to be a prophet, including counselors and apostles who are also sustained as prophets, seers, and revelators, when they are actually fulfilling that capacity, when they are actually speaking with that mantle, as opposed to, sharing an opinion or something like that. He mentioned the stake president, that others listened to the counsel and grew, right? Like, hey, if you were part of the cool kids club that followed the prophet with this letter, a lot of these people, they grew spiritually and so forth. Well, some died. Others have long-term health consequences and complications. So it's not this clean-cut thing that, hey, had you done what you were told to do, that you would have grown. Well, a lot of people have deeply, deeply struggled when they took the thing and the health complications that have followed. Okay, then he shares, before we move on to the 70, he says that we've been given a promise. That if we listen to the counsel, this was interesting. He said, if we listen to the counsel of a prophet or a leader, that was an interesting addition that you don't usually hear. If we listen to the counsel of a prophet or a leader, we will be blessed no matter what. Is that in the scriptures? Can you find in the scriptures where it says that? Presumably what he is referring to is a quote shared once by Marion Romney when he was bishop. He had asked President Herbert Grant to come speak in his ward, and he was driving President Grant home afterwards, and Marion Romney later shares this story and claims that President Grant told him, "My boy, you always keep your eye on the president of the church, and if he ever tells you to do anything and it's wrong, and you do it, the Lord will bless you for it. But you don't need to worry. The Lord will never let his mouthpiece lead the people astray." This was likely echoing President Woodruff, who had said that in the context of polygamy and ending polygamy, that the Lord will never permit me or any other man who stands as president of the church to lead you astray. It is not in the program. It is not in the mind of God. Well, plenty of church leaders have gone astray, right? And what does it mean to go astray? Does it mean to institute completely false doctrine? Well, we've had that happen in the past. Does it mean to say things that are not necessarily right and you're leading people to think that you were acting as a prophet when that was just your opinion, and so it's more of a minor leading astray? Like, what does it mean to be led astray? Does it mean a total veering off course where you're 100% contrary to God's will, or could it be a 1% course deviation? What does it actually mean to be led astray? And so here we have a secondhand quote from ostensibly President Grant saying that if the prophet ever tells you to do anything and it's wrong and you do it, the Lord will bless you for it. Well, why would he even say that if he then says, don't worry, the Lord will never let his mouthpiece lead the people astray? If that is true, if we assume for a moment that the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will never say or do anything that is contrary to the will of God, if we assume that for a moment, then why would he say the first part? That if the president of the church tells you to do anything and it's wrong, and you do it, you'll be blessed for it. Well, what's the point of even saying that if the second part is true? Why not just say, always follow what the president of the church says, because it will never be wrong. God will never let me lead you astray. Period. Why then have to say, oh, and even if it's wrong and you do it, you'll be blessed for it? So there's an inherent inconsistency here with this quote that people rely on, including this state president, I presume, when he says, we have a promise if we listen to a counsel of a prophet or a leader that will be blessed no matter what. Well, we have an offhand statement on a drive home by one leader of the church at one time who was whose counsel was related secondhand by somebody else, and then that was picked up and shared by President Benson and others, and I'm sorry, I don't see in the scriptures where this doctrine exists, and that isn't to say that we can't have new doctrine and revelation from modern prophets. Of course, that's the point of modern prophets. And yet, some of the prophets themselves have said that their own teachings have to be checked and evaluated against the scriptures of the church. And so this to me seems like a claim that is not necessarily substantiated by the established doctrines of the church. Okay, let's get into the 70. This gentleman is Douglas Rosa. He is in the 11th quorum of the 70 and covers the North America West region, including presumably Idaho, where he spoke. Here's his clip pertaining to the COVID stuff.
President Nelson offers the voice of warning. Do we look at that voice of warning as just a suggestion, or do we take it for what it is? President Stark talked about a little bit about this when he talked about following the prophet. And as I thought here, I thought to myself, how many times do we listen to the counsel of the prophet and don't follow that counsel of the prophet? Now, I hope I'm not going to be controversial right now, but when COVID came, there were lots of problems with following the prophet. I'm not being judgmental. I'm not asking for repentance. I'm just giving an observation. And my wife and I chose to follow the prophet. And you might say, oh, you didn't have a brain for yourself. Or, oh, don't you know what was out there? And I said, well, simply, I'm just going to decide to follow the prophet because I know that there's safety in doing so. And you may have your own political opinion, you may have your own medical opinion. I don't really care what your opinion is. I just want you to know that I'm just making an observation. And so, and those of you who didn't follow the prophet, you're still here. You're active in the church. You're faithful temple goers. You're fine. You're great. And I'm not judging you. But the question I have then is the next time the prophet says something that we don't agree with, what will we do? What will we say? What will we teach our children? What will we teach those around us?
All right, let's unpack this a little bit. So first he says, I'm not being judgmental, while then being a little judgmental, effectively. Many people were judged during this whole ordeal. I remember having laser eyes on my back when I wouldn't have, a mask on in church, and when I wasn't, socially distancing from people and so forth. It reminds me of that quote from 1 Samuel 16, that the man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. This is like a scarlet letter, right? There was, oh, you're not wearing a mask. Like it was this outward appearance judgment that so many of the saints were doing. And the letter from the first presidency, again, I'll read a portion of it in just a second, was weaponized. It was weaponized by Latter-day Saints who had this outward appearance opportunity to determine someone's compliance with the prophet, and thereby it's like, seeing the garment line or whatever, right? Like these little outward things to determine someone's religiosity. So, I think he was being a little bit judgmental. And he says, my wife and I chose to follow the prophet. Well, what about others who followed God and heeded inspiration or revelation directly from him not to take the thing that we were urged to take? Right? So he says, my wife and I chose to follow the prophet. Well, what about others who were following direct revelation that they received, not to follow that course of action? He then says, I'm just going to follow the prophet because there's safety in doing so. Well, is there safety in doing everything? This again gets to that quote that Romney shared from Grant, but is there safety in doing everything that the president of the church says to do? Is that really a doctrine of our church? That there's safety in just doing whatever you're told, even if it may or may not be from God? Is there safety in crunching water bottles? We'll get into that in a little bit from Elder Haney. I think it depends on what is actually prophetic. I do believe in prophets and seers and revelators. I think that is an amazing aspect of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. I think the potential for it exists. As I shared in a musing, I think a couple weeks ago, talking about how few revelations we received in the past century plus, looking at when, we've actually canonized something. To me, it's both an institutional issue, but it's really an individual issue, whether we as saints are qualifying for additional revelation, or if the mouth of the prophets have been shut up, if the Lord has turned off the revelatory spigot because of the kind of attitudes and practices of the saints. So by no means is this, and other musings that I've done on this, a finger pointed at the church and, oh, they've lost their way, and, oh, it's the leaders who are corrupt or whatever. This is very much a self-reflection, a reflection on us as a body of saints and how we collectively are doing, because our leaders are an outgrowth and an extension of us. They come from us culturally. They kind of come up with these traditions of the fathers and these attitudes and beliefs and so forth. So I do believe and love the fact that we have prophets, but I don't know that it's doctrinal that everything the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is prophetic. Really, saying that there's safety in following the prophet, I totally agree with that, to the extent that the prophet is acting as a prophet and it's actually prophetic, right? But this weird doctrine has crept in past decades, and I have my theories as to why. I'll share one in just a moment, that we just should follow the prophet and that everything that the prophet says is from God. If he says, I don't really care what your opinion is, well, what about the prophet's opinion? The prophet is a fallible individual, right? This 70 is discounting people's political opinions or medical opinions. Well, what about the medical and political opinions of the church, president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? He is a man. He has opinions. President Nelson in particular was president of the Utah Medical Association long ago. He comes from the medical establishment. He thinks like a traditionally trained doctor and believes strongly in vaccines and all that stuff. And so what about the president of the church's opinion, like the water bottles being crushed that I'll talk about in a second, right? So for him to discount, oh, you have these opinions, well, so do the leaders of our church, and sometimes those are shared, and people presume that that is now prophetic when it might just be their opinion. He ends by saying, the next time the prophet says something that we don't agree with, what will we do? Well, what will you do? As for me and my house, we will use discernment and prayer to try and understand if this is actually from God or not, believing, as I do, that the potential for prophecy exists. And clearly, if the president of the church says, I received a revelation on this, this is what the Lord told me, like, I'm going to give that a lot of weight, because I do sustain that person as a prophet and a seer and a revelator. And so if there is evidence and suggestion or explanation that this counsel being shared is truly prophetic in nature and revelatory, I'm absolutely going to lean into that and have that be a presumption by default, right? And still seek confirmation, as past leaders of the church have counseled us to do. But if none of that is suggested, if there's no explanation, if there's no revelatory, no hint of any revelatory experience, then I'm going to say, okay, well, maybe this is just a well-intentioned opinion from someone who believes this to be true but hasn't actually received it from God. So, Mr. 70, Elder 70, Rosa, that's what I'm going to do next time we are told something, is to evaluate it as I think God would like us to use our brains, to use our critical thinking faculties, to use faith and reason and prayer, and study these things out in our mind and heart, whether it actually be of God, rather than just robotically saying, the prophet has spoken, therefore we should follow. Because I don't believe everything said is always prophetic. And I believe that position is consistent with reality and doctrine, not this idea of unquestioningly doing what the president of the church says to do. Okay, so the letter in question, you all know it. It came out with great fanfare and controversy. The relevant portion of this letter reads that to limit exposure to these viruses, we urge the use of face masks in public meetings whenever social distancing is not possible. To provide personal protection from such severe infections, we urge individuals to be vaccinated. Available vaccines have proven to be both safe and effective. We can win this war if everybody will follow the wise and thoughtful recommendations of medical experts and government leaders. Now, we could pick that apart all day long. I have in past musings. You can go to sundaymusings.org and use the drop-down to find relevant musings and catch up on stuff I've shared. The point of this is not to pick apart that letter and the COVID issue particularly, but just this ongoing challenge that I see that we have as saints as to what a prophet is and how we are led by the president of the church, and maybe this almost idolatrous tradition of our fathers, in a sense, where we follow the prophet, period. Without nuance, without discernment, without a recognition that there's opinion and that this is a fallible person and that not everything is always prophetic, and challenging this cultural, the ripples of that Romney quote that have almost been embraced as this like dogmatic tradition or doctrine in our church, in the absence of any scripture supporting it, or any claim to revelation that, hey, God told me that he will never let me lead you astray. God told me that if I say something wrong and you follow, you still get spiritual bonus points, and there's safety in just always doing what the president of the church says. I think we need to have a discussion about that, because I feel like this has crept in recent decades, past half of a century, to the point where we get quotes like talks like Elder Haney's. This comes from the April 2023 General Conference. Let's listen to the first little portion.
Knowing by revelation that there's a living prophet on the earth changes everything. It causes one to be uninterested in the debate about when is a prophet speaking as a prophet, or whether one is ever justified in selective rejection of prophetic counsel.
Well, in contrast to Elder Haney, I am very interested in knowing when a prophet is speaking, when the president of the church is speaking as a prophet. I'm very interested in that. Why? Because everything else is just well-intentioned opinion, but only that. And I'm not obligated religiously or spiritually to follow it, right? Because I have my own opinions and I seek my own inspiration. And, I don't ultimately care that much about other people's opinions, because they have their own perspectives and influences and traditions and so forth that inform them. I care when the sustained leaders of the church are speaking prophetically. Again, this all boils down to what is prophetic counsel. Haney talks about being justified in selective rejection of prophetic counsel. I totally agree with that aspect. We shouldn't reject any prophetic counsel, right? Selectively or entirely. We should wholly embrace prophetic counsel. But prophetic counsel is not everything said by an individual who is sustained to be a prophet and a seer and a revelator. That is not prophetic counsel. Maybe he's interpreting that way, but I think the plain understanding of prophetic counsel is counsel that is prophetic in nature, that is prophetic. It's prophecy. It's revealed from God, not just, hey, this is the apostle who's been alive the longest, and so now he becomes president of the church, and he said this thing, therefore it's prophetic counsel, right? No, I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that's appropriate. So I agree we should not reject prophetic counsel. But again, we have to understand what prophetic counsel actually is. And that is a debate that I am very interested in. And I think we should be very interested in, to be led by a prophet who is prophesying. But in other cases, we have counsel that is more opinion or well-intentioned good ideas. But we should be very focused on what is prophetic and what is not. All right, next clip.
Brothers and sisters, unlike vintage comic books and classic cars, prophetic teachings do not become more valuable with age. That is why we should not seek to use the words of past prophets to dismiss the teachings of living prophets.
I find this particular quote super interesting. To have prophetic teachings not become more valuable with age. You've got Jesus saying, search the words of Isaiah, which are great. This one seems to me so odd, because the point of prophecy is that it's true and that it's future oriented. It's this thing is going to happen, or that is going to unfold, or, we had wisdom to, we just read in the Book of Mormon as a family the other week, the words of Mormon. talking about how Mormon's like, I don't know why God is having me include these other plates as I compile this record, or Nephi before him, right? I don't know why I'm creating this second set of plates. It's for a wise purpose in the Lord, right? That is prophetic in nature. That has become more valuable with age. The teachings in the scriptures. President Hinckley, I love his quote where he once said that the Book of Mormon is more inspired and inspiring than the morning newspaper. That these teachings absolutely become more valuable with age to the extent that they are actually prophetic. Why? Because it gives us testimony into God's workings with people, past and present. We see God's hand unfolding. We see the culmination of that prophecy. We see it. Oh my gosh, look, Nephi and Mormon were told to do that. How amazing God is to have the foresight that Joseph would lose the 116 pages, and so we're able to have that additional record, right? I think true prophetic teachings absolutely become more valuable with age. But here, Elder Haney is taking the position that if any modern president of the church / prophet says something that is different or conflicts with past prophets, you should have the modern prophet kind of be the trump card to override past ones. Well, what if a past prophecy, an actual true prophecy, is in conflict with a prophetic counsel from the current president of the church, and those two conflict? Well, if that modern counsel is opinion and not truly revelatory, then the past prophetic teaching should trump, the well-intentioned opinion, right? So it really still depends on what is actually prophetic, not just, hey, this person we sustain as a prophet, and he said something different, so we should just go with that, when in fact the previous one might have been the prophetic one. Okay, so now to the water bottle parable.
One day I walked into the cafeteria at church headquarters to have some lunch, and after getting a tray of food, I entered the dining area and I noticed a table at which all 3 members of the First Presidency were seated, along with one empty chair. My insecurities caused me to make a quick detour away from that table. And then I heard the voice of our prophet, President Russell M. Nelson, saying, "Alan, there's an empty chair right here. Come and sit down with us." And so I did. Near the end of the lunch, I was surprised to hear a loud crunching noise. And when I looked up, I saw that President Nelson had stood his plastic water bottle straight up and then flattened it and replaced the lid. President Dallin H. Oaks then asked the question I wanted to ask. "President Nelson, why did you flatten your plastic water bottle?" He replied, "It makes it easier for those who are handling recyclable materials because it doesn't take up as much space in the recycling container." While pondering that response, I heard the same crunching sound again, and I looked to my right, and President Oaks had flattened his plastic water bottle just like President Nelson. And then I heard some noise to my left, and President Eyring was flattening his plastic water bottle, although he had adopted a different strategy by doing it while it was horizontal, which took more effort than with the bottle straight up. And noticing this, President Nelson kindly showed him the bottle straight up technique to more easily flatten the bottle. At that point, I leaned over to President Oaks and I asked, "Is flattening your plastic water bottle a new recycling requirement of the cafeteria?" And President Oaks responded with a smile on his face, "Well, Alan, you need to follow the prophet." Now, I'm confident that President Nelson was not declaring some new recycling-based doctrine in the cafeteria that day, but we can learn from the prompt response of President Oaks and President Eyring to President Nelson's example, and President Nelson's attentiveness to help teach those involved a better way.
All right. So here we see kind of the cultural baggage, the consequence of this mantra that we have all been taught for decades of follow the prophet, right? And yes, okay, Oaks winked and haha and had a smile on his face, right? And yet it's still being used as an example by Elder Haney as to following the prophet. And he extracts a little parable or lesson from this, that even in the small things, even in the seemingly inconsequential things, right, to be guided in our lives, we should follow the prophet. Like, the prophet is a dude. The president of the church is a dude. He's got life experiences and personal opinions and all these things that inform and guide his thinking. That doesn't mean that everything that he says and does is prophetic counsel, right? Like it's just this weird thing where we don't allow ourselves anymore this distinction, and it's very odd how this is crept into the modern church. All right, final little portion that he shares.
When parents ignore the counsel of living prophet, they not only lose the promised blessings for themselves, but even more tragically, teach their children that what a prophet says is insignificant, or that prophetic counsel can be picked through in a smorgasbord fashion without concern for the resulting spiritual malnutrition.
Okay, again, just like you talked about not selectively rejecting prophetic counsel, here he's saying that, we shouldn't pick through it in smorgasbord fashion. I agree, right? We shouldn't reject or nitpick or pick apart any prophetic counsel. But again, it all hinges on what is prophetic. And Elder Haney and others who advance this position have this built-in presumption that everything said and taught over the pulpit, in a magazine, in a letter, in a stake conference, whatever, in a car ride with Marion Romney after speaking at a sacrament meeting, that everything the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints says is and constitutes prophetic counsel. And I just want to very respectfully challenge that idea, because I don't find it being scriptural. I don't see it taught by Joseph, quite the opposite, as we'll talk about. And so this just seems to have kind of crept in culturally, and I think it constitutes a little bit of spiritual laziness, because then we don't have to work out our own salvation. We don't have to use the spirit of discernment. We don't have to navigate through the muddy waters of understanding what is or is not, and really trying to get that personal confirmation and revelation that prophetic counsel is actually such. It's far easier and far lazier to just assume that whatever is said is prophetic counsel, and then you do it, and you're blessed for it. There's safety in doing so, even if it's wrong. And that's just spiritual laziness. It's slothfulness. And it's endemic in our modern church. Okay, so sticking with the COVID issue, and then before moving on, here's Elder Rasband. This was in a conference in South Africa with, I think, the young single adults. This was broadcast online. He's asked a question for saying this. The question was, many high-profile leaders have spoken out against getting the thing. This leaves us in a confusing space. What is your advice to those who wonder if they should get the COVID-19 thing? Here's what Elder Rasband said.
Where we have these conflicts, I would just remind our audience, the youth and the young single adults, that we have the added benefit to have a prophet of God on the earth. And the prophet of God is candidly authorized to speak for the Lord Jesus Christ.
So again, this idea that, well, this came from the first presidency, and, Elder Redland, I don't have the clip queued up, but after all this controversy, he was speaking in, I think, a regional conference, and Elder Redland, shared a little bit of how this letter came about, and he said, well, we prayed about it, and it seemed good to the Spirit, and it seemed good to us. And he was quoting from Acts, when Paul was talking about how they had made some changes that, well, it seemeth good to the Spirit. And so not any attestation to revelation or anything. It's like, well, we worked this out in our minds and it prayed about it, seemed good, so here you go, right? And that's what Elder Renlund cited as the process by which that letter came into existence. And then yet you have Elder Rasband here and others who have gone out and said, well, follow the prophet, even though there was no claim to revelation or prophecy. It's just, well, this was our opinion informed by our bureaucratic advisors and our Kurt McConkie lawyers and our doctors and so forth, and the World Health Organization and all these people. It seemeth good to us and to the Spirit. So here we wrote this letter, right? But then we get the marching orders and the stake president and the 70 and Elder Rasband. It's like, hey, you got to follow the prophet. Well, is that prophetic counsel? So where does this all come from? That's a the answer to that question is multifaceted. But I found it interesting. I was thinking, I do a lot with Tuttle Twins and things to like teach the youth, and I think a lot about how dictators throughout history have always gone after the youth. And Horace Mann, who was basically the creator of the modern school system in America, has this quote where he says that men are like cast iron, children are like wax, right? Adults they're cast iron, they're very rigid. It's very hard to shape them, bend them, mold them. But children are like wax, they're malleable, right? They're manipulable. And so, then I was thinking that primary song has probably had so much influence in the psyche of decades of members of the church, millennials and onward, who have all since the late 80s been singing Follow the Prophet. So I looked into the song a little bit. Dwayne Hyatt is the creator of it. He was asked in 1987 by the Church Music Committee to create a song. They gave him 3 requirements. They wanted it to be about Old Testament prophets. They wanted it to have the feeling of a Jewish folk song. And they wanted to make it a happy, upbeat song. And so then Dwayne Hyatt comes out with it, which then gets 2 years later included in the church songbook. And, generations of Mormons have been taught since that time to follow the prophet. One stanza goes, Moses was a prophet sent to Israel. He would lead them to the promised land to dwell. They were slow to follow, or so it appears. They were in the wilderness for 40 years. Follow the prophet, follow the prophet. You know the rest, right? So yeah, it's about these Old Testaments, but then at the end, it's kind of got this focus on, we have prophets today, follow the prophet, right? And that's just been like deeply rooted in our brains to the point where it's now a catchphrase, just like think celestial, right? It's like follow the prophet, choose the right, these little cultural catchphrases that we latch onto. But Moses himself in Numbers 11 said, would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his spirit on them. So here we're revering Moses was this prophet, follow the prophet, follow the prophet. And we got Moses saying, I shouldn't be the prophet. We should all be prophets. God should put his spirit on everybody. Get your own revelation, right? Moses himself, this idea that the prophet will never lead you astray, never do anything wrong. In Numbers 20 is when the children of Israel are complaining again. They're thirsty. They're like, oh, it'd be better if we had have died, decades ago and back in Egypt when things were good. And so Moses goes to God, and God says, okay, hey, go speak to the rock at Meriden, and then water will flow forth, just like it did years and years ago. And so Moses goes up and he rebukes the people. He says, hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? He lifts up his hand, he smites the rock twice, water comes out, right? But God told him to speak to the rock. Instead, he spoke to the people, he rebuked them, and then he smote the rock twice. So he wasn't following instructions, but also, he's calling these children of Israel rebels. He's not looking at the kind of redemptive, it's almost like he's losing faith in God a little bit. He's just seeing these as unruly children. This is in year 38 of 40. So it's been a long time wandering in the wilderness. He's seemingly frustrated, short-tempered. He's, calls these people rebels rather than seeing them as this, the children of God who God can, redeem and fix or whatever. So perhaps for those reasons, maybe there's something else. In verse 12, the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, because ye believed me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I've given them. So this is where God informs Moses that he's not going to go into the promised land. And Aaron then shortly dies. But Moses is like, you've been waiting all this time, you've been leading this people, and here because you didn't believe in me. So here's the prophet, right? This is my point in sharing the story, who is punished by God. Like, we got all these stories of Joseph Smith's own imperfections and being rebuked and so forth. And here we're singing about Moses. But part of me, I feel like one of the challenges that we have is, that quote that the victors write the war, or write the history. The victors write the history, right? And it's always in their narrative that makes them look good and makes their enemies look horrible, right? And so I wonder if there's a dynamic where in our scriptures, we have all these examples of prophets being prophets, right? Doing these miraculous things. But it is an extremely condensed record. It focuses only on those things, with maybe minor exceptions, such as this story of Moses getting rebuked. But we have these like little vignettes, these little stories of these people being prophetic. So then I think that maybe also gets in our brain that, oh, wow, Moses was just always prophetic, always saying things that were, everything he said was prophetic. Everything he said was from God. Everything he did. And the people interpreted it that way. They just followed everything that Moses said, and or Nephi or Alma, or all these things, where these records become these abbreviated versions of just focusing on their kind of prophetic aspects of their ministry. And so then we read these, and because that's all we're getting, we kind of get wired in our brain that, oh, that's how prophets are. They're just always prophetic. Whereas if you could have like a full and complete record of these people, all their sayings, all their doings, I think what we would find is that these were people who were just, they had their opinions, they did their things, but they weren't always, putting that prophet hat on and communicating God's will. Past prophets, more recent prophets, and I think that if we had that fuller and completer understanding, it would compel us as a church to be like, oh, okay, yeah, like, there's a difference here. It's the quote from Joseph Smith, right? That a prophet is only a prophet when acting as such. That members of the church were sometimes like, hey, Joseph, you're just doing this thing that any of us are doing. He's like, I'm just a guy, a prophet is only a prophet when acting in that capacity. And yet when we read our scriptures, it's just all prophets all the time, which is great. It's amazing to have that record, but I just wonder if one aspect of it being this abbreviated set of prophetic vignettes is that it leads us to conclude that that's how prophets are and act, and not that they're people with their own fallibilities and their own opinions and their own whatever, who on occasion speak for God and receive that, manifestation and can give that direction. So that's just one thought I had in mind. Of course, there's plenty of other counter arguments to this idea that you follow the prophet and you always, unquestioningly, it's from God and it's prophetic counsel worthy to be followed as such. It's thundering and lightning here in Dallas, where I'm at. I'm speaking this weekend, so apologies for the background noise. Here is Elder Christofferson about a decade ago talking about this issue.
At the same time, it should be remembered that not every statement made by a church leader, past or present, necessarily constitutes doctrine. It is commonly understood in the church that a statement made by one leader on a single occasion often represents a personal, though well-considered opinion, not meant to be official or binding for the whole church.
And that makes a whole lot of sense to me, right? Here he is saying this in general conference, this great concession that not everything from a leader of the church necessarily constitutes doctrine. That includes President Woodruff claiming that the Lord will never permit me to lead you astray, or President Grant allegedly saying it to Bishop Romney, who later quotes it, and it gets shared by President Benson and his 14 fundamentals of following the prophet talk, which I should note, according to the biographer for President Kimball, or was it McKay, in one of them, allegedly there was this meeting afterwards with President Kimball, who was upset with Elder Benson for giving that talk because it put him, President Kimball, up on this pedestal, and so he privately rebukes Elder Benson, but nothing is changed, nothing is retracted, so the talk does its damage, so-called. It shifts the cultural perception about follow the prophet, period, and presumably, apparently, President Kimball was displeased with it, and yet, it still went forward. Or think of in 1945 in a church magazine, there was this little editorialization that urged readers, it said, when our leaders speak, the thinking has been done. And President George Albert Smith was really upset, and he indignantly repudiated that statement. But we have the Elder Bensons and Haneys of the world that still advance this idea that you follow the prophet, prophetic counsel, and yet here you have Elder Christofferson saying not everything constitutes doctrine. Sometimes it's opinions. It's not meant to be official or binding, even though people interpret it as such, and then they're chastised in state conference for not following the prophet, right? And so it's like you can't have it both ways. We got to have a real reckoning in the church as to what is prophetic, when is it prophecy, what statements do constitute doctrine, right? The church newsroom years ago posted this. Belief in prophets and apostles at the head of the church does not mean that members blindly follow their leaders. While the prophet of God receives revelation and inspiration to guide the church as a whole, revelation flows at every level, including to the leaders of congregations and to individual families and members. Right? We don't blindly follow our leaders. And yes, the prophet of God is entitled to receive revelation and inspiration, but that doesn't mean that he always does. Right? Being entitled to something does not mean that it's ever present. Being sustained in an office, right? If I am, the father of my household and I'm kind of sustained in a way by my family and supported and upheld in that position, and I have that kind of divine role, I'm, priesthood holder and provide, protect, and preside, right? That doesn't mean that my family should unquestioningly obey everything that I say. It doesn't mean that everything that I say is kind of inspiration from God about how to manage my family. It doesn't mean that all my actions are consistent with that. It doesn't mean that my family should, when dad speaks, the thinking has been done. No, right? It doesn't mean that we create this catchphrase in our family of follow the father, right? No. I have the potential for this kind of divine revelation, and at times I can receive it and share with my family, hey, I feel strongly about this. I've really been praying about this, and I was inspired, and here's what we ought to do. Then they're likely going to put a lot of credence in that and say, all right, right? But if it's just me, like, saying things or having opinions or whatever, they're not following Dad just because I'm the father, right? So, too, I think with the church. I mean, I think that President Nelson was prophetic when he was signing the statement and publicly opposing Prop 2 to allow medical cannabis in Utah, that he personally was, making the church's objection even stronger? No, I don't think that was prophetic. I think that was the former president of the Utah Medical Association with clear pharmaceutically oriented opinions that are in contrast with a natural plant medicine. Do I think that it was prophetic when they issued this letter urging us to get the thing? No, personally, I don't. Do I think that it's prophetic counsel that when we call it the Mormon Church or call ourselves Mormon, that it's a major victory for Satan? Personally, I don't. Do I think that the latest cultural catchphrase, think celestial, is prophetic? Not necessarily, right? But I can allow President Nelson as a person who I sustain as a prophet to have opinions and to give counsel and suggestions and as president of the church to manage the affairs of the church, to change the logo, to change the website from LDS.org to Church of Jesus Christ. Like, all of that is fine and within his domain as the leader of the institution of the church. But I allow myself the opportunity to evaluate actions and statements as to whether they're actually prophetic or not. I sustain these people as prophets, seers, and revelators. As I said in that past musing, we're not really getting a lot of revelation, and there's different types of revelation. I went into that in that last musing. I don't know that this kind of institutional caretaking really constitutes prophecy and seeing and revealing in the true sense of the word, but the potential is there. And to the extent that it's not happening, we, I think, as a church, bear most, all of the blame for not having leaders who are focused on seeking and obtaining revelation on our behalf and new revelations that, why are we going to get if we've treated lightly the things that we've received? So this is a big issue because, the foundation of the church rests upon its organization of prophets and apostles and 70 and bishops and all the rest. But I think that this is a modern creation that has crept into the church, that we have word of past leaders of the church rebuking and saying that's not the case. We want our members to think. We don't want them to unquestioningly obey. We got Elder Christofferson and others who are saying not everything a church leader says is doctrine, and yet then every time a church leader says something, it's doctrine. We get stake presidents like this guy in Sandpoint, Idaho, claiming that we're promised that when you follow what did he say? I'm going to get it exactly here. He says, if we listen to the counsel of a prophet or a leader, which includes himself as a stake president, we will be blessed no matter what. Is that true? Right? Like, if Elder Christofferson is right, and then not everything that one random, president of the church or leader of the church says constitutes doctrine, then we have to apply that to that Romney quote or to President Woodruff, right? Because we don't find this in the scriptures, at least I don't. If you know of any scriptures that, talk about this, please let me know in the comments. But we have to apply that standard from Elder Christofferson to those one-off quotes that are shared around. And yet we get these stake presidents and many others who just say, oh, but we've been promised safety, right? Follow the prophet, period. Don't selectively reject or don't pick at a smorgasbord of prophetic counsel, right? And that doesn't create a church congregation of critical thinkers who are really trying to evaluate and discern and seek confirmation through prayer, flex their spiritual muscles, do the work, right? Instead, it leads to spiritual slothfulness. We get a bunch of spiritual sheep who just follow the prophet, period, and presume that everything is God and consistent with God. And I don't know that creates spiritual strength. It's the path of least resistance to just say, oh, we were taught that, therefore I'm going to do it, without recognizing what I believe to be the truth, that some of these are just well-meaning, well-intentioned opinions, but only that. And that we as a church are not getting much revelation recently, which I think is a condemnation of us as a church and our current attitudes and idolatry and problems that we're not rising up against, that we're addicted to milk instead of meat. We're content with spiritual mediocrity, and we think that, all is well in Zion. And I think we're in for a world of hurt. I think, just as it says in the Doctrine and Covenants, that the future tribulations will start upon my house shall it begin, and from my house shall it go forth. But we content ourselves to think we have a prophet, just like Nephi in the Book of Mormon is rebuking people who say, we have a Bible, we have no more need of a Bible, depriving themselves, limiting themselves from access to so much more revelation and God's word. And I think we say, oh, we have a prophet. We have no need of seeking our own revelation or realizing why we're not getting prophets that prophesy and seers that see and revelators that reveal. We're getting kind of this, tiny little tweaking at the margins and the institutional caretaking, but not the big, canonized, amazing revelations that are providing us new doctrine, new insights, and new counsel. So I believe in prophets, seers, and revelators. I believe in the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. I believe what Joseph Smith did was transformative and amazing. And I believe in the potential for revelation, not only for the leaders of the church, but for us. And I believe that spiritual strength comes from us working out our own salvation, trying to discern, trying to understand, seeking confirmation through prayer, trying to follow in our own lives what God wants us to do, gaining a testimony not of prophets, but of Christ. And prophets are a part of that, because God has revealed, restored his church, and this is a component of it, absolutely. But it's a subset. It's like saying, testimony of baptism. Like, okay, sure, that's like a function of the gospel, but our testimony is in Christ. And we should, as President Nelson has said, hear him. We should seek out his counsel. We should try and get direction from him and evaluate whether the teachings that we're getting and the things that we're being told are from God, or if they're just opinions. Because I don't believe it's doctrinal for us to follow the prophet, period. I believe it's doctrinal for us to follow God when he is spoken through the mouth of his prophet, and when those words as a prophet are prophetic, right, then that is God's direction to us. But not everything stated by a person who is sustained to be a prophet or who is the president of the church is prophetic. That, to me, is the nuance that the elder Haneys of the world and others and the stake president and the 70 are missing, because they see these all as marching orders, and that look at all these slothful saints who didn't get the thing and didn't wear the thing, and consequently are insufficiently righteous and not following the prophet. I want to follow God, and to the extent the prophet is being prophetic and pointing the way and revealing things from God, I'm all about it, and that's amazing. I love having access to people who can speak and do speak for God. I just want to be careful that we don't get these cultural practices seeping in. And look, I could be up in the night. I could be missing the program, missing the boat. There is some new doctrine. This is true. God has revealed that this is the way it works, that, follow the prophet, period, unquestioningly. Everything the president of the church says should be constituted as prophetic. So maybe I'm just missing something. And you can all correct me in the comments. Maybe things have changed and I just missed whatever changed it. And yet I look at this contrast between the early church in the past few decades and this primary song and all these things, notwithstanding the elder Christophersons of the world who were like, that's not how it works, right? But we're getting that conflicting message. It's on the one hand, follow the prophet, and on the other hand, not everything said constitutes doctrine. This to me is a very unsettled and unsettling issue, and one that I think we need to have more of a reckoning about, because we're going to get more stake presidents and more 70 and others on the COVID issue and others chastising and challenging the saints for not following the prophet without us really having a conversation and an understanding about what that even means. What does it mean to you? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to get your perspective on this and have a discussion. Until then, we'll see you next Sunday.